Okay, so like the name implies, this elective is going to be about counterplans that don't have evidentiary support. And kind of my thesis statement for the lecture is that you should read counterplans without cards, that they are strategically valuable. Oftentimes, they're the difference between winning and losing in tight situations. And the arguments against reading cardless counterplans are not as strong as the arguments in favor of cardless counterplans. So, how is cardless counterplanning different from normal counterplan arguments? Cardless counterplans lack evidentiary support. This is the only difference between the two types of strategies, and that's really important. Counterplans don't get automatically or intrinsically strengthened when they have evidence supporting them. Evidence serves to just include warrants in the debate from people that are qualified to explain them. And so counterplans that have good evidence supporting them are often better than counterplans without evidence because they have evidentiary support that makes their claims more likely to be true. However, that does not mean that counterplans without evidence are automatically worse, or that having a card, even if that card is bad, just naturally strengthens the position of an argument. That is a wrong idea that is a little bit pervasive in debate that we'll talk about kind of some specific answers to as we go. But first, I want to talk about some of the reasons why you would want to do this, why you'd want a cardless counterplan. First, many AF solvency arguments have obvious logical alternative means of solvency, such as funding or policy change internal links, or no evidentiary support for their actor, such that, for an example, if an AF said that we needed to change a policy and they did it through Congress and they had no reason why Congress is necessary, they just said that the government should change the policy, you could logically have the courts do that same thing with no real repercussions, since the AF, at least as of the 1AC, doesn't have a really good reason why their thing needs to happen. Second, many AF authors don't know about fiat, and thus their internal links will often assume hurdles that could be easily automatically overcome with an obvious policy action, such as directly fiating a precedent into existence. When you're AF, a lot of times you'll find solvency advocate cards or counterplan answer cards that have really good debate sounding language about why a certain policy change is necessary. So you might have good evidence for why, only your plan solves and any alternative option would fail. And it goes into really specific detail. And a lot of times the reason why it says alternative options would fail are because of things like, political backlash, a lack of funding, a lack of motivation by the president to sign the thing. There's not enough national attention being paid to the issue. And therefore, a lot of normal authors, for good reasons that are not debate reasons, will back off of proposing their ideal solution just because they don't believe that it's feasible. Debate does not have that same constraint, and therefore, it's easy to just directly do whatever the thing AF authors think is a good idea with basically, none of the drawbacks that those authors would face in real life for proposing those options. Third, additionally, there are many AF solvency arguments or internal links for which you will have no evidence to respond. So this, regardless of whether or not you think there's a direct, obvious, easy way to counterplan out of an issue, or you think that the counterplan is a slam dunk, a lot of times you just need a counterplan without evidence because you don't have the evidence. If someone breaks a new argument with a brand new internal link, you may not have the option of a counterplan with evidence in your argument set, and therefore you need to do something else. This is a recognition that that separates oftentimes mediocre or good debaters from really great debaters, is that they recognize when they're in a hole or when they're behind, and they make adjustments to their strategy to overcome it. That's really important, especially when you're debating new affirmatives, or you recognize that your existing set of counterplan options is just not good enough. And making changes in the 1NC and in the 2NC is what's going to bring you back into the debate. Fourth, sometimes you need to handle a 2AC thumper to a DA, and your only option for handling the 2AC thumper to the DA is inventing a new counterplan to deal with it. A lot of times the 2AC will read a thumper and you don't just have counterplans lying around to deal with every thumper or evidence to deal with them. And so you can just counterplan it. This is the best kind for counterplan for cardless counterplanning, or something when a thumper is something that links to the DA that just happened or is about to happen. And that's because those things, likely the link effects of those things, have probably not existed for enough time or have not existed at all. And so you can just quickly remove them. However, if you're going for an economy DA and they read a thumper about, say, the budget bill that happened in March, then you might have a little bit more of a problem just counterplanning to remove that. Because if the effects of that budget have already existed for several months and have thus been baked into the economy, it's quite possible that your counterplan without evidence is not going to do the job or do the trick to deal with what the AF arguments are. Fifth, you all love the argument, love, prefer specificity. It's like, that's a lot of your bread and butter. Cards, while very helpful 95% of the time, can actually be counterintuitively a liability in counterplan debating. And that's because if your counterplan text is directly based off a piece of evidence such that you only use the terms that are in the evidence and you don't add anything that is not in the card, that's the only true carded counterplan because you've not made anything up. It may not be nearly as strategic or specific as what you can write yourself. So if you have a counterplan, if you want to go for the state's counterplan, for example, and the AF is, say, a specific change to a sentencing guideline, and your such that you remove mandatory minimums for one type of crime, and the neg has evidence, or you have evidence for your state's counterplan that says that the states can do sentencing policy. If you just read a card that says the states should reform sentencing policy, which is what all your card says, that's not going to be a very good counterplan. The AF would have very good solvency deficit arguments about you not doing the exact thing that the AF does. Whereas if you were to be a little bit more liberal with your interpretation of your evidence, or to scratch your evidence altogether, you could just directly do whatever the thing the plan does at the state level. And that counterplan, even though that it might not be super backed up by evidence, is better because it's more specific. And so a lot of times you need to go above and beyond the evidentiary support you have for various counterplans in order to make sure that it directly answers or deals with the AF arguments that you're debating. Finally, cardless counterplans are creative and fun. If you've ever wanted to blow $100 billion of taxpayer money on science fiction technology, or basically to bribe a private company to do something, or something crazy like that, this is your chance. Cardless counterplans allow you unlimited flexibility to use the power of the government to solve problems. And kind of like I was saying earlier, not a lot of people assume that level of fiat power when they're just proposing actions. Most legal and political scholars are conservative by nature. And so this is a very powerful tool that you have in your arsenal that you should use. So what differentiates a cardless counterplan, a good cardless counterplan from a bad cardless counterplan? And I like to call it the standard of obviousness, which is the heart of a cardless counterplan. When statements are obvious in debate, regardless of whether or not they're counterplans or thumpers, they don't need cards. If you were debating the economy disadvantage and you said coronavirus thumps the economy, we're at an all-time low depression, you wouldn't need a card for that in the 2AC because it is completely obvious. Everyone who does not live under a rock knows that is occurring, and therefore you don't need a piece of evidence to suggest that the coronavirus pandemic is hurting the economy. Similarly, if there are times when counterplans, and I'll get you into some more specific examples as we go, are so directly obvious and would immediately resolve an AF argument that they similarly don't need evidence. What do I mean by obvious specifically? I mean that the analytic, logical arguments in favor of it are far better than the analytic, logical arguments against it. I'm going to repeat that because that's a really good definition of obviousness that will apply across various issue areas of debate. And it implies that the analytic, logical arguments in favor of it are far better than the analytic, logical arguments against it. This does not mean that the argument is perfectly logically true. And there are times when your logical, when an argument is logically airtight, which means that there's no alternative thing that could be true. And that's a great situation, but it's not always the case. And so, for example, a time when that is the case is, say, if the AF reads an economy advantage and the neg says that the economy is low now, and the AF concedes it, it is now no longer logically possible that the economy is high now, because everyone in the debate has agreed that the economy is low. And such, that argument has now become logically true. Airtight, logically true. There are other times, though, when an argument is analytically and logically strong, such that the arguments are far better in favor of it than against it, when it's still not logically airtight. And to return to our economy example, we should go back to the coronavirus thumper, where the one side says that the economy has an economy internal link, and the other side says the coronavirus pandemic will ruin the economy. That is not an airtight logical argument, such that there's room for that argument to be wrong. And if there's room for an argument to be wrong, such as the economic modeling is incorrect for coronavirus and therefore the economy is actually doing a lot better, maybe the stock market has already rallied and thus that's the only indicator of economic progress. Maybe the vaccine will come out in 2 days and the economy will quickly go back to normal. The governments will do perfect financial policy. So there's room for this argument to be incorrect, and therefore it's not a perfect logical package. But the arguments in favor of it are far better than the arguments I just gave you. It's probably not the case that the economic models are wrong. It's definitely not the case that the stock market is always a perfect indicator of economic success. The vaccine's probably not coming out in 2 days. And therefore, the reasons and, kind of a concurrence of modeling shows that we're in a really bad economic depression. And therefore, the arguments for this logic are far better than the arguments against it. And so another example of this, in kind of my personal opinion, and there's a little bit more disagreement, is extinction outweighs. The logical arguments in favor of extinction outweighs, to me, are far better than the logical arguments that extinction does not outweigh, something like structural violence. And even if you don't agree with that, or you don't think broader debate agrees with it, you'll often see a lot of evidence for extinction outweighs answers, like cards that say structural violence outweighs, cards that indict the theory of extinction outweighs, cards that are epistemological critiques of predictions, and you will not see a lot of cards that say extinction outweighs. And the reason is that regardless of whether or not we all want to believe it, one of those arguments is a lot logically and analytically better than its alternative. And therefore, who needs to read evidence in that debate is biased in favor of people answering extinction outweighs. This idea applies to counterplans very well because of kind of the stuff I've already talked about, where there are obvious immediate solutions to problems that authors don't consider. And so if there are obvious immediate solutions that we can exercise using the full political executive power of the government, that plays into our concept of obviousness, because instead of having to make really complex linear predictions about things such as the economy, when obviousness comes into concern or comes into play, we can just use the government to fix issues. And it doesn't really take a genius to understand places where policy action, if taken decisively, would resolve a problem. It's also important to understand the strategic purpose fulfilled by a cardless counterplan. This is different than reasons why I think cardless counterplans are good. This strategic purpose refers to the role that the argument plays in the debate, or the role that the argument should play in the debate. And so the difference between strategic purpose and, say, like, why you should do a thing is like, why you should do a thing is similar to a recommendation for a chess move. You should move your queen this way, or you should move a pawn 2 spaces instead of 1, etc. The strategic purpose or strategic value assigns what the point is of that argument on the broader debate. What are the kind of sum total of potential strategic moves that you can make with a queen or a pawn in a chess game? What is the value of those pieces and how do they affect your chances of winning across many, 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 many games? Here, a cardless counterplan is not the same strategically as, say, a state's counterplan or a court's counterplan, which attempts to solve the entire affirmative in one fell swoop and then eke out a net benefit. This is not the same as a cardless counterplan, which should be thought of more like extra powerful case analytics or DA analytics or counterplan add-ons that are put on their own page. They are, when they are done correctly, very potent and very strong. And we will talk about examples of when cardless counterplans can rise to the level of a state's counterplan or maybe even surpass it in its strategic capacity. But when you're thinking about the full set of strategic potential by a counterplan like this, you should not think about it the same as many arguments you will have read in other contexts. Okay. So, what not to do when doing cardless counterplanning. And I'm going to do this, and then I'll say what to do, and then I'll take questions, and then we'll move on to a few other concepts. So what not to do when reading a counterplan without a card. First, don't make your counterplan something insane or controversial, such as that the AF could make easy, convenient, logical arguments against it. There are plenty of examples of this, like invading another country, banning an industry, etc. A lot of times, if you've debated on an international relations topic before, like the China topic that happened a few years ago, a lot of people thought that a good, obvious cardless counterplan for AFs, to solve AFs that just wanted to induce China to do something, would just threaten to invade China. And they'd be like, China, if you don't clean up your emissions like an AF tried to solve, we're just going to invade you. This counterplan maybe had a decent reason why it could pressure Chinese action, although I think the reasons why China would say no to that are pretty good. But the obvious downsides of that counterplan were huge, and thus it did not make a lot of sense to read it, because the affirmative could easily make arguments about how that would deteriorate relations with China, potentially cause a war. China might say no and test the United States' hand and call the bluff. It would make us look terrible to all of our alliances. It would make other countries that were necessary to reduce emissions less willing to participate in our emissions reductions, because it would look like we took a backhanded heavy approach. It would make other countries that were reluctant to reduce their emissions more reluctant to do so, because they knew if down the line they stopped doing that we would threaten to invade them. And thus, that counterplan had a lot of logical downsides. The logical and analytic reasons in favor of that counterplan were a lot weaker than the logical and analytic reasons in support of it. The reason why this is especially true, though, in this specific area, i.e. reading counterplans without evidence, is that when you do that, you've opened the floodgates of cardless arguments. Normally, if you're reading a counterplan and you have a great set of evidence to back it up, and the 2AC read a solvency deficit that was not based in evidence, you would just tell them to come back with a card. If you read, if you read the state's counterplan and you had a bunch of good evidence that the state's counterplan solved the AF, and the 2AC comes back with, yeah, but the states don't have the oversight or the budget to do it, and they didn't have a card for that, you would easily dismiss that argument on the grounds that there was no evidentiary support for it, and there was evidentiary support for your counterplan. The converse effect applies when you're reading a cardless counterplan, which is that since you're not reading evidence, the AF is allowed to make a lot of arguments that don't meet the evidentiary standard that you would normally apply to AF arguments. Unless you have to make sure that your counterplan is better than maybe a counterplan that had evidence was, so that you don't automatically lose to these kind of things. Similarly, don't make your counterplan garbage. If you're designing a counterplan, that you're not beholden to a piece of evidence, you should do it to perfectly tailor it to the affirmative. You shouldn't make it generic or forget to add specific planks to deal with AF arguments. You should instead make it hyper-specific to their internal link. If they have a specific policy doctrine that they invoke when they do their plan, you should similarly invoke that specific policy doctrine in order to make it as close to the affirmative as possible. If the affirmative spills over and solves a specific type of technology, let's say that they do something like cyber or digital forensics, and that solves cloud computing in the air, and that cloud computing, the app says, will spill over to F-35 fighter jet maneuvering. This is a real scenario, by the way. And you say to our, cardless counterplan, the federal government should invest in cloud computing. That's okay. It's better than saying the government should invest in computing, but it's not good enough. And the reason is that the AF has said that their technology would get used in a specific sector, i.e. fighter jet maneuvering. So you should fiat that the government does research on cloud computing as directly applied to fighter jet maneuvering, and you should require that the Air Force and the Navy use the new cloud computing technology in their fighter jet programs. And even more, you should have them being the ones doing the research, because that means that all of the cloud computing research will be specific to fighter jet maneuvering programs. That way, you've actually done more to solve this internal link than the AF does, because while the AF doesn't get to directly fiat the fighter jet strategy that they would like to, because they're bound by the topic, the negative is not bound by the topic, and so it can just directly fiat the end of the AF's internal link chain. There are a lot of times when this works that may be a little bit kind of counterintuitive or even taboo, but are really strong. If an AF has a scenario all about the United States retaliating with a nuclear weapon to a terror attack, you can just counterplan to have the United States not do that. And that way, you've just eliminated an entire AF scenario. The AF cannot, again, because of topicality, fiat a change to the United States' strategic doctrine when it comes to responding to nuclear terror attacks or to terror attacks in general, but the neg can. And you should not exercise restraint when it comes to just dealing with the end of an AF's internal link chain. This brings me, and there's still a couple more things that I'm going to say don't do, but we'll get to those in a second. But I do want to introduce the concept of object fiat, because that might be a thing that is going off in all of your minds right now as potentially an argument that the AF will have against, say, don't retaliate to a nuclear terror attack. And the answer to that is wrong. Object fiat is not an answer to that counterplan as a theory argument, both because object fiat is a bad argument in general, but also because that is not definitionally what object fiat is. And I'll explain them in reverse order. Object fiat is a theory argument that the negative cannot fiat the object of the resolution as an actor of a fiated policy. So on this topic, the object of the resolution is, well, there's not really an object. I mean, if you count kind of weird indirect object stuff, maybe the areas policing, testing, and forensic science could be considered objects of the resolution, but they're not objects. They're not objects of this resolution that are potential actors. So there's no real object fiat violation that is possible on this topic. And so for the next 12 months, or maybe more like 8 months or 10, when you're debating and the 2AC says object fiat, you can easily dismiss that argument by just saying, we meet, we've not fiated an object of the resolution, next. And the reason why object fiat arguments exist are kind of that the resolution is designed to test whether or not the actor, so usually the United States federal government, should take action in order to induce another actor. So I'm going to go back to the high school China resolution for a second, because it's a really good example where the United States federal government then was required to increase diplomatic or economic engagement with the People's Republic of China. In that resolution, the People's Republic of China was the indirect object of the resolution. And so there was potentially an object fiat violation against counterplans that fiated China directly. There was also an international fiat objection because there's potentially theoretical limitations on the neg being able to fiat other countries. But for the time being, we'll just discuss the object fiat component. The reason why the AF may say that you can't fiat direct our objects as actors is that it does not test whether or not the federal government should take action to induce another actor. If I said, Miles, or if I asked you, do you think that I should go give my neighbor $10 in exchange for them mowing my lawn? And, we could have a whole debate about whether $10 is enough, whether, I should do that, whether or not they'd say yes, whether or not they'd cut my lawn poorly because I didn't pay them enough, whatever. We could have a whole back and forth. If you said miles and miles, you're forgetting an obvious solution. Just have your neighbor cut your lawn for free. That doesn't test the question I'm asking. It does not answer the question that I posed to you. And thus, it does not get to really the goal of what the resolution is trying to test. And therefore, an object fiat theory argument can say that that doesn't test the question of the resolution, which is, should I try to induce behavior of another actor? The reason why this argument is bad, though, is that trying to figure out what the question or the heart of the resolution is a fool's errand. We shouldn't look at the resolution and try to be like, well, I can deduce what the purpose of the resolution is by looking at the fact that there's an object and an actor that acts on that object. You should look at the resolution as a static object in a vacuum. In the resolution, in this example, I am paying my neighbor $10 and trying to get them to mow my lawn. That is an action regardless of intent. And there is an opportunity cost to that action, namely that they just do it for free. If I pay them $10 to do it, I have prevented or traded off with an alternate opportunity where they just do it. And that option may be unlikely because kind of the purpose of what we're discussing is me inducing their action, and thus kind of implicit in that debate is that it's likely that they're not going to do it for nothing. Debate does not concern itself with the likeliness of options. It does not concern itself with how possible or likely an opportunity is to occur. It only tests the desirability of one idea versus another. And therefore, to fiat the object of the resolution, it does undercut a debate about the likelihood of inducement working, but it does not undercut the debate about the desirability of an induced action versus a free action. And therefore, there's still an opportunity cost to be tested. And so for both reasons, that opportunity cost does not link to any AFs on this topic or any counterplans on this topic because there's no fiatable object of the resolution. And also because object fiat is a weak argument, I am not that worried about directly fiating things like the end of AF internal link chains, like fiating the United States just doesn't go to war with various countries that the AF scenarios are about. It doesn't lash out. You can just directly fiat a piece of technology that the AF says is good, etc. This is especially strong because a lot of AF terminal impacts involve military action, and military action is under the guise of fiated public policy. And so many military scenarios can be dealt with by easily changing military policy or easily changing the a military action. So a lot of AFs might have a scenario about the United States using nuclear weapons first in a conflict, kind of like that terrorism scenario, but also maybe with Russia or with China. And we could just counterplan to have the United States adopt a rigid no first use policy, which would prevent the United States from ever using a nuclear weapon first. And while the AF impact evidence might not have assumed that, because the AF impact evidence, for very logical, real world reasons, would discuss the possibility of the United States using nuclear weapons first in a crisis, and would not consider the possibility of us adopting a no first use because that's probably not a thing we would do. That's not a concern for the neg because we don't consider likelihood in the desirability of a policy. We only consider whether or not that policy is good or bad. Next thing not to do. I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but I think it was important to introduce some of those concepts because it really tells you that you should make your counterplan as good and strategic and applicable as possible. But next thing not to do, don't make your strategy wholly reliant on a cardless counterplan. The 2AC or the 1AR might have a headshot against your counterplan that you didn't see coming. It's possible that they anticipated this cardless counterplan and were directly prepared to deal with it. Then that no first use example, maybe they have a scenario where the United States lashes out with nuclear weapons in response to a conventional action by China in the South China Sea, and you think no first use is just a slam dunk. And to me too, it intuitively seems like that's the case. But when the 2AC or the 1AR pops out with really good reasons why no first use actually makes the strategy or the security situation worse, maybe because it causes Japanese or South Korean proliferation, or it causes Russia to strike the United States, or it causes the military to backlash against the political leadership in the United States, then you're in a little bit more hot water. You can always kick your counterplan, and it's not a reason you'll lose, but it does mean that you are probably going to have to rely on something else. And therefore, you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one cardless counterplan basket, because the 2AC and the 1AR might have something to say, and even worse, they may have wanted you to make that argument and might have a really sick strategy waiting for you. Additionally, your judge might be a little bit more hostile to this type of argument because that they're crazy, because there's no real logical reason why cardless counterplans are de facto worse than their alternative, but they might be hostile to it anyway. And so you might need other options for reducing the case or dealing with thumpers if at all possible. Another good example in the thumper area is that if you read a counterplan to deal with a thumper, you will also want other answers to the thumper, such that if the counterplan goes wrong, like maybe they have the 2AC or the 1AR has a good DA to answer your counterplan, then all of a sudden you're in really hot water again, because not only do you have to deal with this whatever DA is to your counterplan or kick your counterplan, if you do that, you now have to answer your thumper again, and you had no answers to it in the block. And so any new thumper answer you'd make would be new. And so you can't put all of your eggs in one basket on a strategy like this. That's generally true across all debate arguments, that you never want to be wholly reliant on any one thing, because you never know what's in your opponent's box. But it's especially true here when these strategies are perhaps a little bit more flimsy than others. Finally, don't make your mechanism something very arcane, crazy, or legally complex, such that it needs evidence to prove that it even works or exists. A really good example of this is like state nullification, where let's say the AF has an argument that federal law prohibits state foreign policy interaction. So let's say we're talking about this MLAT business that one of the AFs is putting out, or one of the labs is putting out, that regulates the exchange of information relevant for criminal investigation between the United States and other countries. And there's a decent reason why states might not be allowed to get super involved in this, because states are prohibited constitutionally from engaging in agreements with foreign powers. This is like a very established doctrine in United States law, that the federal government is responsible for international affairs. Let's say the neg, being the neg, decides to just have the states do it anyway. And they're just like, the states will not only do this, but they will nullify the federal laws and constitutional provisions that prevent them from doing foreign affairs power. They'll threaten to put the president in jail if he enforces it, and they will not donate any, they'll not give any tax revenue, and they'll protect all of their citizens from having to pay federal taxes, and they will not let the federal government arrest any state citizen who doesn't pay federal taxes, etc. That, in a weird vacuum, may work, but because it is so legally complex and crazy, there's really good reasons why the AF could dismiss that on the grounds that it's just fake, made-up nonsense, and that there's probably a decent reason why we shouldn't consider that legal policy, just because the neg has not even met their initial burden of proving that that thing exists and is a thing the states can do. And so you really want to make your counterplans, if they don't have evidence, not only obvious means to solve, but things that their actor can do. Another example is, and it breaks my heart a little bit to say this, the Constitutional Convention counterplan, which is a bad cardless counterplan. And the reason why it is bad is because constitutional conventions are like the heaviest axe in American policy. They are never been done successfully, well, at the state level, and they are incredibly, incredibly heavy-handed. No one really knows how they would work, if they would cause runaway amendments to the Constitution. We're not entirely sure on the exact legal basis for them. There's really ambiguous language in the Constitution about whether or not Congress needs to approve the amendments versus just approve the process for the amendments. And it's all really complex. And so just saying that this is a thing that your counterplan does without any evidence to support that it happens is terrible because there's not a good reason why this is a real thing that could happen. And the AF could just be like, this is fake and made up and no one even knows that this would work. And so the neg would then have to prove with evidence that from legal scholars, ideally, that this is a thing that could happen. It could get worse though, because the negative might fiat really weird new ways to use constitutional conventions. Like maybe they'll fiat basically the creation of a federal government at the state level that just does the plan and say that that solves because it's basically a federal government that does uniform action, but it's just a sub-federal body. And we do that through a constitutional convention. That counterplan has gotten so complex and crazy, there's no way to prove that that could even ever happen, that all of the legal hurdles necessary to do that could be overcome. And so while AFs may want to go down the rabbit hole of, oh, it doesn't solve signal and it takes too long, what they really should start their answers with is that this is a fake made up policy. And it would be no different than the neg fiating Nigeria should amend United States election law. That is, I guess, a thing you could say out loud, but there's no legal basis for it. There's no reason why it would work. It's basically completely made up. And for that same reason, the counterplan should be ignored on the grounds that it is just legal hogwash. And so you shouldn't make your counterplans subject to such easy AF dismissal. Okay, conversely, what should you do when reading a cardless counterplan strategy? First, obviously, you need to identify the place for a cardless counterplan. There's an obvious internal link, thumper argument, or solvency deficit that can be easily and immediately resolved by an obvious policy change. I want to go through some examples, even though we've already talked about some, just to kind of calcify the idea and to help you build skills to identify places where this is strategically valuable. First is the most obvious. Something needs to be funded. Counterplan, fund it. Easiest in the book. There's a reason why you never see advantages that end in something getting funded. And there's a reason that when you probably suggested an advantage that has something get funded to your lab leaders, they immediately told you they wouldn't write it. The reason is not that things don't need to get funded or that funding things is not important or doesn't have good impacts. Many, many, many good impacts come from funding things, but that the counterplan to obviously fund it is just so strong. Another similar version is something needs to get passed, like another bill. The plan motivates Congress to pass something else. You can just counterplan, have them pass the thing. This is why, and in your moments of absolute genius, you may have thought about the politics advantage. I know that when I was like a sophomore in high school, I thought this was like brilliant and no one had ever done this. I was like, okay, well, if there's a policy or politics disadvantage, let's innovate and make a politics advantage. The reason why we don't do that is because you just easily counterplan the end of that internal link to pass that policy, and then that thing no longer matters. And the reason why this dynamic occurs is that the AF is bound by intrinsicness, i.e. they're bound by making sure that their AF is the only way to solve an issue, and the negative is not bound by intrinsicness. They're not bound by the idea that only, that the AF is the only thing that could cause a harm, or, et cetera, or the, politics DAs being an example. I'm not going to go into intrinsicness right now because that's a whole other elective that I think happened and you could watch a video on it, but this dynamic exists. Another example is a judicial doctrine should be set, like the Supreme Court should not adhere to the political question doctrine anymore. I actually debated an AF that had this as an advantage, and you can just have the Supreme Court not respect the political question doctrine anymore, or not use it anymore. And that solves the whole advantage. Outside of AF solvency areas, you could do something like current policy thumps the disadvantage, such as a pending court case that may get ruled in the same direction of the plan. You could just counterplan to have the court rule the opposite direction and thus not mess with your disadvantage. There's one tricky case, though, which is worth going into a little bit in depth and discussing one more theory issue before I'll take a couple quick questions and then move on to some other stuff in our last 20 minutes. The tricky case is when your counterplan has the government not do something. So these are really common in cardless counterplan terms because they're oftentimes the most obvious, because either the AF solvency deficit or a thumper or a uniqueness problem, what have you, are all based on the government doing something bad now or doing something that complicates a counterplan or complicates a DA, and you want to just stop them from doing that.
but what's the theoretical justification for a counterplan that makes no policy change, but just locks in the status quo? The counterplan does not pass a bill, it does not rule on anything, it does not have the executive take any action. In fact, when the counterplan occurs, when fiated action occurs, nothing about the world will change. That's very different than how a lot of us think about fiat, because normally we think about fiat and we're like, that it literally means to bring into being. It means to change or to create something. Does this counterplan have, so then do we think, is that counterplan legitimate? Would a legitimate version of that counterplan have to pass a formal policy prohibiting the thing the counterplan stops instead of just stopping it? And the answer is actually no. That the counterplan that just has the government stop doing something is completely legitimate. And the reason why, again, is the idea that counterplans are formalized statements of opportunity cost. Hopefully you've already watched the counterplan lecture that Truth gave, or that you kind of are familiar with this idea. But formalized statements of opportunity cost means that counterplans are not advocacies. They're not changes to the status quo in the same way that a plan is a change to the status quo. A formalized statement of opportunity cost is just a better way of stating a thing that the act prevents from happening, but is good. And therefore, we can summarize opportunity costs as harms to fiated action. For example, if I was going to pay my neighbor $10 to mow my lawn and I only have $10, me spending $10 on a new t-shirt is an opportunity cost to that action and is a harm. Even if I maybe wouldn't have gone and spent my last $10 on a t-shirt, it is a thing I'm no longer able to do, and thus is an opportunity cost. In the case of stopping an action, not doing an action is always an opportunity cost to doing an action, and vice versa. And that's very important because that justifies counterplans that are just stopping actions or not doing them. If I go and pay my neighbor $10 to mow my lawn, not paying them $10 is always an opportunity cost to that action. It's always a thing I could have done but didn't. And therefore, if you think about counterplans as formalized statements of opportunity cost, it makes sense why this counterplan is completely legitimate. If someone says theory against this counterplan, that prohibitive counterplans or status quo counterplans are illegitimate, you must say that that's an arbitrary restriction. And it's arbitrary because it uses an incorrect definition of a counterplan in order to make a restriction. I'm going to discuss more later about why arbitrary restrictions are bad and how you can bolster your theory answers such that you don't lose to arbitrary restrictions, but just know that this falls into that category. I just looked at the clock and realized I probably don't have a ton of time for some questions now, so I want you to just save them till the end, or you can put them in the chat and I'll get them at the end, but I'm going to keep going. So a lot of people will say solvency advocate theory to answer cardless counterplans. That's like a lot of times the app's bread and butter to deal with these types of strategies. And I think that solvency advocate theory is maybe a top 5 worst argument in debate. The reason is that there's no definition of what a solvency advocate is. There's no real exact definition of what a piece of evidence would have to be in order to justify a counterplan, other than it's a piece of evidence that uses the exact language of the counterplan. But no counterplan would ever meet that, and no AF would ever meet that. And the reason is that debate uses different language and concepts than solvency advocates. Worse, even if that solvency advocate was perfect, it exactly used the phrase, it wouldn't mean that that phrase should happen immediately. And therefore, even if that solvency advocate used the exact terminology of the counterplan, it couldn't actually advocate the counterplan because fiat is immediate. It also doesn't assume durability. No one writes articles saying that this policy should exist in the year 3050. And the reason is that that's not a normal thing that we consider when we write policies in the real world, but in debate, we do use durability. And so there's actually no evidence that could ever fully advocate a counterplan or an AF. And so no counterplan or AF would ever meet any definition of a solvency advocate. Again, if the AF has a definition of a solvency advocate that is less stringent than that, it says, oh, well, it just has to kind of suggest the counterplan. Again, that is arbitrary. And we will discuss arbitrary interpretations in a second. You should say counterinterpretation debaters are solvency advocates because they advocate solvency. That's the only truly non-arbitrary way to discuss solvency advocates. I am a person who is rational and can make arguments, and therefore I'm advocating in favor of the counterplan. That doesn't mean that evidence is not better, and so it doesn't hurt the app, because if they really have evidence why only they're able to solve something, they should have no problem beating a cardless counterplan. And cardless counterplan's bad is a really bad argument because they shouldn't be that hard to beat. If your counterplan is if your app can easily be solved by an obvious change to the status quo, then it's a bad advantage. It's not that the counterplan is unpredictable. Further, when you're debating new affirmatives or apps that are drawn from arcane small corners of the literature, you're never going to have a solvency advocate because debaters can't anticipate every single thing they would ever have to have a solvency advocate about, especially if the app standard is that the counterplan has to, or the evidence has to recommend the counterplan's mechanism and the app, and then they break something crazy like, oh, we should do forensic science for nuclear material. There's no way you're going to have a states counterplan card that's about that. And therefore, that argument creates a perverse incentive for apps to choose bad, small ideas that no one writes about and always break them new just because they know there won't be a counterplan solvency advocate literature about it. And so it not only is this an arbitrary restriction because there's no true definition of a solvency advocate, but it's also really hard for the negative to debate because they wouldn't have a solvency advocate in the majority of the time. I want to talk next about 2NC counterplans. And I've kind of implied a lot about 2NC counterplans by referencing things like counterplanning out of thumpers, but I do think that they deserve a little bit extra time on their own. So first, when to 2NC counterplan? First is responding to a new 2AC development that the 1NC counterplan strategy did not account for. Things like new solvency deficits, uniqueness problems or thumpers on your DA, or impact turns. A lot of times you need to deal with those, and you would not have anticipated them in the 1NC unless you can add them to the 2NC. Sometimes you need to clean up a 1AC argument that you did not notice, such that you just need to add to your case defense strategy by adding a counterplan to your 2NC. A little bit more controversially, let's say that your AF straight turns politics, and they say that the policy won't pass now, and link turn, the AF will cause the policy to pass. A little bit controversially, you could just 2NC counterplan to pass the policy, and thus you now solve the straight turn that the AF had. There are some decent theory arguments as to why the neg can't do that, but again, that's the question of intrinsicness. And it's not a question directly of whether or not counterplans should have cards or not have cards, so I'm not going to go into it now. But if you want your lab leaders' opinions, and I'm sure they will have lots of diverse opinions on whether or not you can counterplan out of a straight turn to politics, you should ask them. And I'm not going to commit to yes or no because it's really open. 2NC counterplans, strategic implications. So again, I talked about strategic implications and strategic value as different than kind of when to do it. And so I'm again kind of returning to what are the strategic potency of a 2NC counterplan. It's good. Well, one, it can cover up holes that you missed, which I discussed already. Second, it can create unique pressure on the 1AR because not only does the 1AR have to answer the 2NC counterplan, they also have to extend their original argument. And so if they forget to do either, if they just answer the 2NC counterplan to answer a thumper but don't extend their thumper, the neg can just kick the 2NC counterplan and the AF has not extended a thumper anymore, and therefore it doesn't matter anymore. This happens a lot of the time. And so if you're neg and you read a 2NC counterplan to deal with a thumper argument, make sure that the AF extends the thumper, because if they don't, you no longer need your counterplan. And vice versa, if the AF just extends the thumper but doesn't really give a good answer to the 2NC counterplan, that thumper is now strategically useless because the neg has dealt with it with a counterplan. However, there is a converse of this, which is that there are now new 1AR arguments to deal with. New 1AR add-ons if the counterplan solves 1AC arguments. They get new perms and new DAs to your counterplans. These are largely not threatening offensively because you can kick the 2NC counterplan and the 2NR, but if you're reliant on it, it is way harder to answer new permutations and new DAs and solvency advocates in the 2NR than they would in the block. And the reason is that the AF then gets a 2AR to extend those solvency deficits and re-explain those permutations, and you don't have a 3NR to deal with it. So the AF will have much more time to discuss their answers to your new counterplan than you have to deal with those answers. And therefore, if you anticipate needing a counterplan in the 2NC, put it in the 1NC. There's no benefit to hiding counterplans in the block, because against a competent opponent, they're going to punish you for that in the 1AR. And if an opponent was just going to drop a 2NC counterplan, you probably could have beat them on anything. AT 2NC counterplan theory. Again, bad theory argument. Why are counterplans in the 2NC different from the 1NC? Not really for any reason. The neg needs 2NC counterplans to react to new arguments, like I kind of already said. And if you couldn't counterplan in the 2NC, AFs would be incredibly vague in the 1NC and then explain all their arguments in the 2AC, because they knew that the negative would not have another chance to counterplan internal links. They would save all their best solvency arguments and solvency deficits to the 2AC, which would cause a lot of sandbagging and would make the debate really late breaking and bad, because the AF would have a monopoly on explanation because they would not explain anything in the 1AC. Again, since counterplans are just formal statements of opportunity cost, and thus just a different form of harm or disadvantage to doing the plan, we allow new disadvantages and harms to doing the plan in the 2NC, and so we should just allow new counterplans, just like we allow new affirmative offense in the 2AC in the form of add-ons and solvency deficits. And thus, allowing the negative to read new DAs or read new case defense in the block, but not allowing them to read a new counterplan is another example of an arbitrary restriction. And this is where I want to impact that. Arbitrary restrictions are bad. Arbitrary restrictions on negative ground are bad because the AF has an incentive to make them as restrictive as possible, and can do it after seeing the strategy that the negative is committed to, which breaks the game. Because the AF can just selectively decide which negative arguments they no longer want to answer and just say they're too hard, which is why the only restrictions on negative ground should exist are ones that everyone should see coming ahead of time, and not restrictions that just because the negative has done something that is too difficult to deal with. Now I'm going to discuss quickly answering cardless counterplans, and then I am going to answer a couple questions if I can. Answering cardless counterplans I'm not devoting a ton of time to, because most of answering a cardless counterplan is the same as answering a normal counterplan, and you should apply all those same tricks. But I'm going to talk about a few extra things to deal with in the case that the counterplan doesn't have evidence. First is you should write intrinsic arguments, write intrinsic affirmatives, and have thumpers that are hard to counterplan out of. When you write affirmatives, be overwhelmingly cautious about logical counterplans, and you should assume a neg with no scruples, who has no problem counterplanning the end of your affirmative internal links out. And so you should do things, write advantages that don't just culminate in another bill being passed or the US military taking an action. Write advantages that end in foreign wars happening, or shifts in public opinion occurring, because those are much harder to directly counterplan out of. Also, just like obviousness is the neg's weapon in cardless counterplan, it cuts both ways, and obviousness is thus also an AF answer. Make obvious logical arguments about the implications of the counterplan. Make DAs to the counterplan solvency deficits and permutations that are logical and analytical. Remember when I was talking about the Constitutional Convention counterplan, and I said you don't need a bunch of evidence to explain why that's a bad idea. You just make logical reasons why this is a concept that is not legally backed up. No one knows if it would work, and no one even knows if, this law is possible to pass. Those are all good logical analytic arguments that are obvious, and thus you don't need evidence to answer a cardless counterplan if you don't have it. However, if you do have evidence to answer a cardless counterplan, you should use it, because that will matter far more to the judge, and you should explain why it matters far more to the judge than the neg's analytics, because a legal scholar or a person who's writing about the political controversy is far more qualified to opine about whether or not a counterplan would solve than a bunch of high school or college students. Solvency advocate theory, like I said, is kind of D tier, but there is a way to make it C tier instead, which is that you can make an argument that the neg doesn't need a solvency advocate for the specific counterplan, but they need a piece of evidence that recommends the mechanism or the legal action that the counterplan takes. It's a little arbitrary, but it's not that arbitrary to require that the negative needs evidence that recommends just a legal mechanism, because that just ensures that the legal mechanism the neg is doing exists. And that's basically enough to ensure that a debate happens. And that's not super arbitrary, because fact-checked, is your thing real, is a quite logical, obvious hurdle for the negative to clear. That ensures the counterplans are grounded in literature and that the affirmative can draw obvious answers to the thing, but also allows negative flexibility to deal with new and small affirmatives because they can apply mechanisms that they have evidence for to those new and small affirmatives. Finally, when you're answering 2NC counterplans, remember to answer the counterplan, but also to extend your original argument that the counterplan is meant to deal with. Because if you only do one of them, the negative can just do the thing that you didn't extend, i.e. extend the counterplan if you didn't answer it, or just kick the counterplan because you didn't extend your original argument. You should also be a punisher. You should have lots of new offense, perms, defense, and solvency deficits to the 2NC counterplan, and the 2AR should be ready to go for them with new explanation. Because the neg is introduced to counterplan for the first time in the block, the 2AR should not feel bad in giving new explanation for why that 2NC counterplan fails, or is bad, or is not competitive with the affirmative, because all of that explanation would have been occurring in the 1AR if the negative had read the counterplan in the 1NC. And thus, the strategic cost of the negative reading that counterplan new in the block is that the AF gets a bunch of new late-breaking answers to deal with it. So that's the lecture. I'm going to go through and answer any questions that popped up in the chat during this time. For the counterplan solves the straight turn, what's the answer to the perm? You can't just go for the disad alone anymore. Yes, so this counterplan is not offense for the negative, that it solves the straight turn. The AF could totally perm it. The net benefit to this counterplan would be whatever else you wanted to go for in the debate. So let's say that you had an economy disadvantage and a politics disadvantage, and the politics bill is about relations with China or whatever, and it solves relations with China, but your econ disadvantage is about manufacturing power. You could counter, and the AF straight turns it and says only the AF causes the bill that solves relations with China to pass. You could counterplan to just do the bill that solves relations with China, and the econ DA is actually still a net benefit to that counterplan because the econ DA doesn't link to the counterplan that solves the straight turn, but it does link to the AF. So all that counterplan does is clean up AF offense and allow you to go for a different strategy. That counterplan is not an offensive reason why your new DA is good. It's just a reason why your other strategy is viable. There is a slightly different case where you can counterplan to solve link turns, which does allow you to still go for your DA. So let's say that you're reading a politics DA, and the AF says link turn, criminal justice policy is popular. If you have specific link evidence that says that drug policy is unpopular, and let's say that's what the AF is about, you could counterplan to do criminal justice reform in another area, say sentencing reform for nonviolent crime or digital crime or whatever. Because that is also criminal justice reform, it would be as popular as the AF and therefore solves the AF's link turn. And the only residual link between the counterplan and the AF is that the AF is drug policy, which you have a link to. And therefore you can counterplan out of link turns in order to make the only unique link to the AF the specific negative link that you're going for. And thus there are ways to counterplan through AF offense that allow you to still go for your DA. But what I was referencing earlier in the lecture was abandoning a DA by just counterplanning out of a straight turn that the AF was maybe forcing you to go for. Okay, and you can ask your lab leaders more about counterplanning out of AF offense on DAs and the strategic costs and benefits of that. That ends our time, so I am going to end the elective. Thank you all for being a great audience and showing up, and I wish you the best of luck with the rest of your camp.